Let's go. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're here today to talk about antimicrobial stewardship in food animal production and why it's important. It's been 5 years, I think, now since the U.S. Food animal industry implemented the Veterinary Feed Directive. And the VFD is a set of guidelines designed to help preserve the effectiveness of antimicrobials used to treat diseases that affect livestock and people. Most of us would agree, I think, that the meat and dairy producers have done a good job with stewardship programs since VFD was implemented. But as we approach its 5-year anniversary, we thought it would be a good time to learn about how leading experts view responsible antimicrobial use today and how it might evolve in the coming years. We also wanted to share the perspective of farmers and animal product retailers whose daily activities have been affected at multiple levels by antimicrobial stewardship programs. Our program today will lead off with an overview by Professor Pamela Ruegg from MSU, who will describe some key foundations of antimicrobial stewardship and how it's practiced in the U.S. Then we're going to go to dairy, to the Black Locust Dairy in Stanton, Michigan, where Phil Durst and Sienna LaHeis from MSU will interview farmer Jack Jepson there. And they'll discuss how this farm is practicing sound stewardship. From there, we'll go southwest, I think about 40 miles to Grand Rapids, Michigan, to Louise Earl Butcher Shop, where owner Matt Smith will talk about how he selects farms to partner with to meet the healthy local food preferences of his customers. And then finally, we'll call on Professor Mike Apley at Kansas State University, who will share his perspective on antimicrobial stewardship and how current recommendations might be tweaked going forward. There will be a couple of brief technology checks following the second and fourth talks. And we'll hope you use that time to answer a couple of questions that we'll pose to you. Shelby Warner will explain in a minute how to ask questions. Panel members will answer questions you pose following their presentations or during the next speaker's talk. Sometimes there will be a bit of a lag there, but we'll have time during the open discussion to answer other questions. If you intend to apply for continuing ed credits, instructions will be provided to you at the end of the very brief survey following the open discussion. Now, Shelby will say a few words about how to ask questions on Zoom before we get to Professor Ruegg. Shelby?
Hi there, everyone. So today for our Zoom webinar, we will be answering questions through the Q&A feature. You'll find this feature at the bottom of your screen in your little Zoom toolbar. You just click on that Q&A icon, and then you will type in your question and click the send button, and it will send it our way. If you're having any audio or other technical trouble throughout the presentation, please give our help desk a call. The phone number is 800-500-1554. We also will have the chat open, so in case you have any comments or other things that you would like to notify us about, you can send us a message through there. And that wraps up our tech for today.
Well, thank you, Shelby. Without further delay, then, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Pamela Ruegg, the Ellis Chair of Antimicrobial Resistance at MSU. Who will describe how animal agriculture can benefit from antimicrobial stewardship programs. Professor Ruegg, are you there?
Hello, I'm Dr. Pamela Ruegg. I am fortunate to be the inaugural holder of the David J. Ellis Chair in Antimicrobial Resistance and Large Animal Clinical Sciences in the College of Veterinary Medicine. Some of you may remember Dr. Ellis as he was an esteemed veterinary practitioner who had a big impact on the swine industry in the state. And I'm proud to tell you he was one of my teachers when I was a student here. So today I'm going to be talking about a very important and practical subject today that is influencing all of our animal commodities, and that's the subject of antimicrobial stewardship on our farms. All right, the subject of my talk today is how we in animal agriculture can actually benefit from antimicrobial stewardship programs. And this is a little bit different take on this because I think we often look at these antimicrobial stewardship programs as something that's being imposed on us. But I'd like everybody just to maybe suspend that thought for a minute and think about the good that can happen when we in animal ag engage in these programs. You know, one of the things that is very true, regardless of which type of animal protein we're producing today, is that consumers get competing messages about antibiotic usage in animal agriculture. You just look at these two slides, these two pictures, these two pieces of news that I'm got up today. One on your left is a report from the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, which, you know, who really knows who that is? And it says, US pigs consume nearly as many antibiotics as people do. That's one message that gets transmitted. And then on the other side is a message in the National Hog Farmer that says, US pork producers are committed to responsible antibiotic use daily. And both of these messages are messages which are competing for space within our consumers. I'm going to be referring, you know, I work primarily in the dairy industry, but the issues in the dairy industry and swine and all of animal ag are the same. And I'm going to show you a little bit of data from the dairy industry as well. This is from a study we published this year called Quantification of Antimicrobial Usage in Adult Cows and Pre-weaned Calves. And this is quantification across 40 large Wisconsin dairy farms. What this graph shows is on the horizontal axis, we've got 40 farms, data from 40 farms. And on the vertical axis is the average daily dose per 1,000 animal days of antibiotic used. And it's not important that you understand the metric. What I want you to take a look at here is the tremendous variation. Our lowest using farm, this farm that I've labeled number 1, used about 5 defined daily doses per 1,000 animal days, whereas our farm number 40 used approximately 40 animal daily doses per 1,000 animal days. And we see this kind of large variation among farms regardless of commodity. And part of the reason we see this variation is not many of us have a good context for what normal antibiotic usage is. And the same thing applies to measures that have been done in the swine industry. Lots of variation. This is kind of a messy slide, but this is a study that's titled Variation in Use of Antibiotics Among Swine Farms in 2016 and 17. It came out in 2020 with Davies and Singer. And you really don't have to understand the details of this. You just need to look at kind of the pictures. Let's look at 2016. Those colors are all different types of antibiotics. And let's just contrast Farm A and Farm C. You can see Farm A used 70% of their usage was tetracycline. Farm C, approximately 35% was. Farm D, almost 90%. This isn't volume, but it just shows you how much variation there is in usage among farms. And this is reminds me of very early in my career when we were trying to figure out some of our other metrics, like what's the right amount of certain diseases. We had to start collecting this data, understanding it, and trying to understand what was achievable before we could make progress. And I think the same thing applies to our use of antibiotics. And when we start understanding and benchmarking this data, then at some point we'll be able to, on individual farms, make decisions about, hey, do we need to work on certain areas of improving antibiotic usage? Okay, so with that background of all this variation that we see out there in farms, I want to just introduce the subject of what is antimicrobial stewardship. And just all commodities right now, in response to these societal pressures, have statements about what antimicrobial stewardship is and why those of us producing animal protein are interested in it. And the National Pork Board has a policy on antibiotic usage in pork production, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And these statements are very similar. They say things about using antibiotics responsibly, prevention of disease, reducing the use of medically important antimicrobials, and following guidelines to make sure that antimicrobial usage or antibiotic usage on farms is done in a responsible manner. So this is some of the pork producers. We agree to implement the following guidelines to demonstrate our values: advocating objective, scientifically rigorous studies and risk assessments, engaging with veterinary oversight, promoting stakeholder education, demonstrating compliance with regulatory requirements and treatment records such as in PQA+, and encouraging transparency. So these are all really good things, and I'm really an advocate of these, but I also want to point out that when we start looking at antimicrobial stewardship at the farm level, there's beneficial things for us that actually can improve the efficiency of our agricultural units and the welfare of our animals. And you see this a little bit in the American Association of Bovine Practitioners definition of antimicrobial stewardship, which says that they're committed to reducing the need for antimicrobial drugs by preventing infectious disease, and when antimicrobial drugs are needed, using them in an optimal way. And the thing I kind of like is that this antimicrobial stewardship is introduced as a cycle of bacterial disease management. And that's where I think we need to be moving toward, is kind of just incorporating the fact we need to diagnose our bacterial disease, think about non-antibiotic alternatives. When we do have to use antimicrobials, think about the least amount we need to use. And then after we're finishing up with our disease management, our bacterial disease management, reevaluating the need for antimicrobials in future cases. That's a little bit different spin on it, because now we're moving directly in, are we optimally managing bacterial diseases? That's a really important concept for us to understand. Antibiotics are for bacterial diseases, and they help the animal's immune response successfully eliminate bacterial pathogens. And so when we think about antibiotics, we should be thinking about bacterial diseases. And when we think also about the value of antibiotics, we have to understand that the value of that antibiotic is the marginal difference between the spontaneous cure rate and the treatment cure rate. So let's just take a look at this little graph I've put up here to illustrate this. So let's say we have a viral disease, and you can see this green bar. Antibiotics don't help at all. So if we have 100 animals affected with a viral disease, and 50% of the time the animal's immune response can effectively eradicate that, the spontaneous cure rate itself is what is helping that animal. Now let's move into bacterial disease A. We've got bacterial disease A, which is the middle one here, where we've got 50% spontaneous cure, and we're going to use an antibiotic that has 50% efficacy. And that's the other important thing to understand. Antibiotics themselves rarely have 100% efficacy. So if we treat 100 animals and 75 of them get better, 50 of those were spontaneous cure, and the antibiotic actually cured 25. What we see as cure is the combined amount of the spontaneous cure plus the treatment cure. So it's important for us to understand which bacterial diseases can respond to the antibiotic and which bacterial diseases can't, and which bacterial diseases have high spontaneous cure rates if the other animals are otherwise immunologically competent. And these are the things you need to be working with your veterinarian on and achieving bacterial diagnoses. So one of the things I want to introduce today is the concept that we need to do a better job of measuring antimicrobial usage. Because if we don't measure it, we can't manage it. And this article that I'm showing you here is an article called Antimicrobial Use in Weaned Market Pigs in the United States, Assessed via Voluntary Sharing of Proprietary Data. And this is a fairly recent article that came out in this last year by Davies and Singer. And what you're seeing across the horizontal axis is individual farms labeled with A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then the vertical axis is simply showing the proportion of antibiotic usage on these farms that is critically important, highly important, or not important. And this critically important category, these are the drugs that the FDA and the World Health Organization has said, hey, we need to reserve the use of these for human diseases when possible. And you can see that in this data, on just these few farms, Farm C, about almost 50% of their antibiotic usage is these critically important antimicrobials. They probably don't know this. They probably don't know that they're using more than other farms because we haven't done enough benchmarking. And so we have to start thinking about this antimicrobial stewardship management cycle. On our farms, benchmark and assess the usage of our antibiotics, develop farm-specific goals for usage, assign actions to members of the farm treatment team to reach those goals, and then assess the results of actions. So I'm proposing we move from antimicrobial stewardship as something that's imposed upon us that we have to reduce antimicrobial usage into a management cycle where we're looking at understanding how and why we're using antibiotics, and then ways to optimize that use to ensure the welfare of the animals we're dealing with. So to do that, we have to understand the different types of antimicrobial usage. The easiest to defend and the one we need the most is therapeutic usage, and that's treatment of disease. So that would be, for example, treatment of pigs showing signs of respiratory disease. And then the prophylactic and the metaphylactic, they kind of merge together a little bit. Prophylactic usage is the treatment of antibiotics for prevention of disease. That would be, for example, if you treat pigs in the same pen with other ill pigs. And then this metaphylactic usage, this is often the most problematic from the consumer side, where we're using antibiotics to minimize the effects of an expected outbreak. And that would be, for example, if we treat pigs housed in the same building with ill pigs. And if you look at this NOMS data, you can see that this metaphylactic use, treat all pigs in an entire room with clinically ill pigs, is pretty common. About 50% of farms do that. And that's one of them that's the hardest to justify when we think about judicious usage of antimicrobials. So there's some criteria for justifiable antibiotic usage, and these criteria are listed here. And this is from a book called Antimicrobial Stewardship in Animals, or from a chapter in a book. So here's the 6 criteria we need to think about. We need to have the local veterinarians developing and assessing protocols. We need to make sure animals are examined before antibiotics are used. That's coming back to, is this a bacterial disease that requires the use of antibiotics to achieve cure? So there should be a reasonable benefit that a bacterial infection is present. We should target that bacterial infection with the narrowest spectrum drugs. We should use as short a duration as possible. That's one that in my career, we've gone from short to long, back to short duration recommendations. And we should avoid extra label usage when possible. So let me just spend the next maybe 5 minutes to conclude here, talking about some practical ways to do that. And that's the 5R principles of stewardship. Responsibility. We need to have a treatment team who's engaged. Reduction. We need to have focus on preventive practices. Replacement. Are there things other than antimicrobial usage that we can do? Refinement. We want to evaluate the quality of antimicrobial usage and monitor the outcomes of those treatments. So assessing quality of antimicrobial usage, want to make sure we're treating bacterial infections. We want to make sure that we're following approved protocol that the local vet is engaged in, and that we're using the right dosage, duration, and route. So putting this into action, responsibility and leadership, our goal is to create accountability. We can do that by regular training of an approved treatment team, prescription and drug purchase process review, and assessment of a recording system. The benefit for the farm is increased competency of employees and a defined chain of command for animal health decisions. Secondly, how about reduction in need for antibiotics? Our goal, and this is a common goal on virtually all farms, is to prevent bacterial diseases. Our actions are to determine the incidence of the most common, let's say the big 5 bacterial diseases, and review your detection, diagnosis, and reporting criteria. Then make an action plan focused on one disease. Our benefit is to reduce disease rates and increase production efficiency. Third, replacement. Our goal is to use non-antimicrobial interventions when possible. So let's reevaluate and re-examine our vaccination programs. Let's consider non-antimicrobial interventions when we have chronic diseases. And our benefit is reduced morbidity and mortality losses. Refinements number 4, and that's to improve our quality of antibiotic usage. So we need to read the labels of the antibiotics. We need to evaluate the diagnostic criteria for bacterial diseases, review our antibiotic choices, and evaluate our rationale for duration. Our benefit is we're going to preserve the efficiency and efficacy of antibiotics used on your farms. And we're going to reduce usage probably of those critically important and medically important antimicrobials. And then finally, we need to review, are our current treatment protocols effective? We define the outcomes, evaluate the costs, benchmark usage. If you've got multiple farms, compare them, address why there's higher use on some farms than others, and we're going to come out with better treatment results. So to conclude, antimicrobial stewardship simply means better management of bacterial diseases. It's good for the farm. It's similar to the other things that we do to make incremental improvement. We've got to have benchmarking, goals, actions, and assess our results. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ruegg. That was excellent. We did have a few good questions come in. It looks like you were able to answer them in real time, but we've got a couple of minutes. If you would like to say a few words about these questions and what your answers were, maybe beginning with the question around how many farms currently practice disease cycle of management properly, and what are the key barriers to implementing a program like that?
Yeah, I think that was really an excellent question. I don't actually have data on exactly what people are doing, but I would say in my experiences, more than 35 years as working in animal agriculture as a veterinarian, I think that it's the goal of most farms to minimize bacterial diseases, to maximize animal health. And I think our key barriers are the barriers we have on many of our farms. We're resource limited. We don't have enough people on farms. People are always have more tasks than they can complete. And then I think especially when we look at this antimicrobial stewardship and kind of optimizing the use of antimicrobials, we don't have enough data to figure out how we're doing on farm A, yes, compared to the general population. And I think that's something we really need to strive to improve.
Thank you. And one more that I liked, question, and I'll paraphrase a little bit here. Do we know what other management strategies were used by the low antimicrobial dairies and where health and milk production is high on the low antimicrobial farms as it was on the high antimicrobial farms in that Wisconsin study?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, we have at least 2 more papers coming out of that data set. I've got people working on them right now, but I can't answer that question. I don't know. This was a USDA funded study. We made one visit to these farms to collect the data. We have these farms shared their computerized animal health software, but we don't have actually enough data to do a risk assessment. We only have 40 herds. And I did a previous study looking for risk factors of animal health on organic versus conventional dairy farms, and we required 300 herds to be able to answer that question. So we just don't have a sample size big enough to do that. But I will say these farms were not random. We recruited farms that had outstanding animal health records. And because of that, these farms, I would say in general, would be at the upper echelons of overall management.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how those data come out when we have larger numbers included so that we can monitor disease and performance in addition to, or correlate with antimicrobial use. Thanks again, Professor Ruegg. And if you're able to stay online, we'd like to have you. I'm sure there will probably be a few other questions come in. I think we'll move ahead then, Shelby, to our next speakers. And I think Phil Durst from MSU Extension and Sierra LaHeiss are going to beam in from the dairy in Stanton if our connections are good. It looks like they've got a good sunny day there. So Phil, are you and Sierra there?
Yes. Hi, I'm Phil Durst with Michigan State University Extension.
Hi, I'm Sierra LaHeiss. I study cows in the Department of Animal Science at Michigan State.
All right, and we're here with Jack Jepson, one of the partners of Black Locust Farms. Jack, great to be here with you. Thanks a lot for having us out. Tell us a little bit about the dairy operation you have here.
Our dairy operation was started in 1923 by our grandparents. I'm in partnership now with my brother. It's a limited liability company, and we're milking about 240 through the parlor every day. We've got close to 30 or 40 dry animals, and then we also have all of our young stock. We're running probably close to 220 young stock, from baby calves all the way to bred heifers.
So if I did the math right, that's about 500 head of cattle on the farm.
Yeah, yep.
And 500 head of cattle that you want to keep healthy.
Correct. Yeah. We put a lot of effort into keeping our animals healthy and different ways of doing it. Yeah.
So you put a lot of effort into keeping your cattle healthy in a lot of different ways. Let's just talk about some of those ways. What are some things that you do specifically for animal well-being and health?
Sure. We have several different fields that we look at. Ventilation is one in the summertime, and in the wintertime you want to keep the air flowing with them. And
hence the fans right here that we shut off for the video.
Yep, right? Yep. Barns have curtains on them. We open the curtains up as much as we can to keep the ventilation and the air flowing. The sanitary, we try to keep the stalls as clean as we can, and I'm sure we could do better, but we do the best we can with the manpower we've got. Nutrition's a big thing.
Yeah. Let me just fall back just for a minute on the ventilation and the stalls and the sanitation, because we know that there's bacteria and viruses that are environmental, and some of them are even in the air, and so ventilation is moving outside air in, inside air out to get those bacteria out of here. Dryness and cleanliness obviously reduces the life of bacteria, and so those things really keep animals healthier because it's getting bacteria away from them, and therefore lowering the exposure.
Right. Yep. And some of the lactating animals we bed on sand, which is a non-organic bedding, which the organisms can't live that well in that kind of an environment.
Yeah, so again, it's about reducing exposure, even in choice of bedding, right? Yep. So then I interrupted you at nutrition. You were talking about that.
Yeah, nutrition, we feel that you've got to have a good balanced diet for your animals to keep them healthy. We work really close with our nutritionist. She comes maybe once every 2 weeks, looks at the feed. We keep feed samples up to date and a good balanced diet through our nutritionists, yeah.
And speaking in terms of nutrition, and with your nutritionist coming, would you say that you work with a large team to help,
That's good.
improve overall health?
Yeah, good question. Actually, today we are having our, I call it our consultant team. Our nutritionist is involved, our veterinarian is involved. We have some agronomist people. Phil usually comes. We've got grad students and things like that come. So yeah, we've got a really good team of professionals that we deal with. Yeah.
And what we do at those meetings is we talk about the progress of the operation. We look for ways the operation could improve, and we identify things that are going well and things that maybe aren't going as well as possible, and lay out a course of action.
Right. Yeah. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but we talked about different fields that we use for health of the animal. This last spring, we made an investment on our dairy with a program called Cow Manager,
yeah.
And some of the animals have orange tags in their ears and their transmitters. And we've got a mode on that transmitter that is a health mode.
Okay.
So if a cow's starting to get sick, it will relay a message to our phones, and then we need to go out and track that animal down to see just what her problem is.
Right, and the way that's doing it is it's by monitoring her behavior,
Yep.
monitoring her rumination. It's saying this animal is not normal in her behavior, not normal in her rumination, and therefore she may be sick. I think it monitors her temperature too, doesn't
Right,
it?
yep,
Right.
yep.
Yeah, so it's a great way to pick up disease problems early.
Right.
And as you say, an ounce of
Prevention's worth a pound of cure.
yeah, absolutely. So what you do here on the farm is a lot of ounces of prevention.
Right.
You pile on the prevention because that's worth a whole lot more than,
Right.
than just coming back and trying to cure things.
Yep.
Right.
And if the animals aren't healthy, that affects our bottom line tremendously, because right now the margin in dairy is very tight.
Yeah.
And so you want to keep your animals good and healthy, so you don't have to buy into antibiotics, which there is a place for antibiotics on every farm. If you can't keep them healthy with your nutrition and all your other practices, then you have to refer back to an antibiotic.
Right. So the first course of action for health is, of course, all the prevention stuff we do, all the
Right.
good management of taking care of the animal and the environment the animal's in, and reducing exposure to pathogens. But by times, in any population of individuals, whether it's
Right.
humans or whether it's animals, individuals get sick.
Correct. Yep.
And when an animal is sick, well, we talked about detection, early detection. That's
Right.
really important. And when an animal is sick, you can do nothing, or you can do something.
Right. And we don't use, our philosophy is that we don't use any more antibiotics, any more drugs than we absolutely have to keep our animals going in the best health that they can. It's just added cost, and with the profit margins where they're at, you just can't spend the money foolishly.
Right. So you have set up with your veterinarian a plan for dealing with sick animals.
Right. We've got a game plan with our vet on different ways to go about treating animals and what kind of drugs to use and such as that.
Yeah. And that relationship with your vet is really an important relationship. We call that the VCPR, the veterinary client-patient relationship.
Yep.
And that's something that you really do a lot with here.
Yeah.
You have a really good relationship with your veterinarian, and she's very familiar with your management, and the recommendations are tailored to your operation.
Yeah. We've got the owner of the clinic and then two of her co-workers or her workers. We're real close with them. They actually come out every week. We do our herd health every week. They check the animals, look them over, check for pregnancies and such as that. And if they need to have some treatments, then we go ahead and treat them. Yep.
And she joins us here at these consulting meetings to meet with the overall team and discuss overall welfare of the animal.
Yeah, we have our vet is real good at looking over our records along with the rest of our team, and they crunch numbers and we find out where we got to do better at.
And you know, I think that's an important point to bring up, is that records is a part of management.
Yeah.
And you use your records, you just don't keep records, but you use your records. You look at has the animal been treated before? You look at you know, what sickness the animal has had, and what have we done in the past with the animal. And so as your veterinarian sits down and looks over your records and consults with you, those records become a management tool as well.
Right. Yeah, and you know, other areas that we look at too for the herd health is we have a hoof trimmer that comes once a month to make sure the animals have good feed underneath them. If they don't have good feet to be up on, to eat, to go through the parlor, they're usually laying down, and if they're laying down, they're not eating, which they should be, and then they can turn sick that way. So,
so there's a lot of things that you do to keep animals well. When you use antibiotics, what are the safeguards that we keep that antibiotic from ever getting into the milk?
Real good question. If we treat an animal that's lactating, usually we put leg bands on them so whoever's milking can actually see the animal that's been treated. And her milk will be discarded, goes down the drain, doesn't get anywhere near the tank, the actual milk that's sold. And then after the withdrawal period from the antibiotic, we usually test the animal individually, and she has to clear the test on the farm before her milk goes into the tank. Once the milk's in the tank, every day the milk truck picks the milk up, takes samples, and then they go to the dairy, and when the truck gets to the dairy, the truck is sampled. As long as the truck is good with no antibiotics showing, then the milk is processed for the consumer. If the truck is tested and it's positive for antibiotic, then they go back to each one of the individual samples from the farm, and then they find out who the person is that contaminated the truck. But in the past, we have, every farm is not perfect, and we're one of them. We have had a sample of the tank that we felt was positive antibiotic.
Because there was a cow that was misidentified or that got in the group. She was milked into the tank,
right?
And nobody caught it in time.
Correct.
Until she was milked into the tank.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in that instance, we have our milk co-op. They come out and take a sample of the tank, and if it is a positive tank, then we usually dump that milk down the drain, and it gets nowhere near the milk that goes to the consumer.
So you go to great lengths. I mean, dumping a tank load of milk down the drain is not something that we want to do.
No,
but
it's not.
It's so important that we ensure that the milk supply is wholesome and antibiotic free, that you're willing to do that.
The milk on our farm, I would drink it before it would go to the consumer any day. It's the most pure product that you can get.
Right. So consumers can have confidence that there's not going to be antibiotics in the milk, and that antibiotics are used responsibly. You know, I think that's one of the things that consumers have really shifted now to saying, okay, we believe the milk is safe, but are the antibiotics being used responsibly on the farm? And your response to that would be?
Sure. You know, our vet prescribes certain drugs, and she puts confidence in us to use them the way she's prescribed them. You know, and if something happens and we don't, and we get caught, and then, you know, we have a consequence to pay. But no, we're responsible with the drugs that we use, yeah.
So when we talk about stewardship of antibiotics, and we talk about stewardship, right? And I come out and I say, are we being good stewards of the antibiotics? And you tell me yes, but also we're being good stewards of the cows too.
Yeah.
How does that play out?
You know, you can see our animals behind us. Some of them are pets. We've sold some animals before that they went out the driveway, and my gosh, I didn't think it would ever bother me to see one of them go down the road, and when she went out the driveway, it's kind of like, wow, that was my pet that just went down the road. So, yeah, you know, as baby calves, you treat them good, and usually they turn into pets once they get older.
Yeah, and you know, it's important that calves be that we be good stewards of antibiotics in calves as well too. And first of all, again, we go back to the prevention part, because prevention is critical. And you know, we were just looking at the calves and the hutches, and that's great environment from a ventilation standpoint. They're fed well, so they're on a higher plane of nutrition, so that they, again, have the ability to fight off disease. And we know that sometimes calves get sick, but you know, it's being a good steward of antibiotics and yet being a good steward of the animals as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. When the new baby calves are born, there's 3 things that we do to them as soon as possible. Actually, I guess there's 4. We dip their navels with a iodine solution. They get an injection of a, I guess it's called it's BOCI. It's
So selenium and
selenium, yeah. And then they get a bolus of another type of a stimulant for their immune system,
Yep.
and like that. And then they actually, as soon as we can, we get colostrum or a colostrum substitute into them to get them up and going as fast as we can.
Yeah, because colostrum has the antibodies that the mom was
Right.
carrying, and then we get those into the calf right away, and that's a great
Yep.
way to protect the calf's health.
We need to try to get it into them within 4 hours of birth, because they don't get the total benefit from the immune globulins. There, I screwed that up, didn't I, Phil?
Immunoglobulins.
There you go, yeah, that. But yeah, so we take good pride in our calves. We take, you know, as much good care of them as we can.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that you, as representative of the dairy industry today, because you know we're talking about other farmers as well too, that management is so important in health, and the health is a cornerstone of the dairy.
Right.
You know, it's just a critical aspect. Antibiotics are a tool that we use, but they're used in a way that is responsible and judicious, and certainly not overused, because that
Right.
just doesn't make any sense from anybody's point of view.
And the antibiotics is one of the last sources that we want to use, just because of the costs and such. But if it gets to the point where we do treat the animal and the animal doesn't make it, if the animal does die, a lot of times we go to Michigan State University to actually see what the disease or what the culprit was of them dying, and we work close with MSU. Actually, our dairy farm right now is in a couple studies that they're pretty in-depth studies. The one has been going on for about 5-6 years, something like that. And we just started a couple of new ones this last year.
So you're involved in health-related research, animal health research, and that's great. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to be able to have more information to manage with. And
I feel that whatever we can do here on our farm will help the whole dairy industry as a whole. You know, that's what we're here for, is to help everyone else out in the dairy industry.
yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about the dairy industry is the sense of community.
Yeah.
And the farmers are part of a community of farmers, and they feel the link to each other and the responsibility, if you will, to each other as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Jack, thank you very much.
Yep.
It's been great to talk with you.
Phil.
And look forward to meeting this afternoon.
Yep.
Thanks, Jack.
Yep. Thank you.
Bill and Sierra, that was great. Thank you. And please thank Jack for us. We did have a couple of good questions come in, Phil. You've probably seen them on your screen, but if you didn't, I think I can paraphrase them here. First question was, have VFD restrictions led to more or less disease on the Michigan dairies you're familiar with?
That's a excellent question, and it kind of parallels a question that was asked previously to Dr. Rugg about the use of antibiotics and maybe the reduced use of antibiotics and the level of disease. We did a survey of producers across all animal types a couple years ago. Results were not published, but we did a question survey to animal producers we had a number of responses. And one of the questions we asked them was about this very thing. Has the VFD caused dairy animals to be healthier or unhealthy? And certainly there are some producers for whom the restrictions, the VFD, which did restrict in some ways, create those restrictions, did cause animals to suffer consequences of health problems. However, what we also heard, and this was more response, what we heard was that people made management changes that reduced the prevalence of disease on farm. They increased the monitoring, they increased the prevention, they improved the environment, and so that when VFD came into effect, they responded by actually improving the management so that there was less need for antibiotics and so that animals were healthier. And so I think that we have to say that that's the kind of response that we're looking for from all farmers, whether the dairy or any animal type.
So there was probably a transition during that first year, but things have settled down. They're figuring out what they need to do, which is a good segue to the next question, I think, that was sent in. And that is, what is the greatest barrier to sound antimicrobial stewardship on the dairies you visit?
That's another great question. And I think that, I'll answer off the top of my head on this, but I think it's going to be time. I think that and Dr. Rogue mentioned the fact that everybody is busy and the time to sit down and thoughtfully, as she said, benchmark, set goals, take actions, and assess the results. That's so hard to carve out that time for. It really takes time to do that. One of the things that the VFD rules created for us was really pushing the veterinary client-patient relationship. And on some farms, where that relationship really wasn't there, it caused the veterinary to have to be more involved in the operation. I think that's a very positive thing because it does then give the opportunity for producers to sit back and say, okay, what are we supposed to be doing and what are we doing and how's it going? But I would say the greatest barrier is time. Dr. Rugg has initiated a project in which Sarah and I have been involved, in which we will sit down with a team on the farm, and we're going to be doing this through the winter. But it's going to take some time on the farm to really benchmark, to set goals, to take actions, to assess, and that's a time commitment that some producers are willing to make, and that's going to be a great investment of time on their part.
Sounds like a great study. When will that be ending, by the way?
We will be initiating that actually this month, and it will go for about 6 months, and we'll have data from that certainly by this time next year.
Great. We look forward to seeing the results from that. Thank you. Thank you, Phil and Sierra. And again, please thank Jack for his time. Shelby, I think we'll move then to our first tech check. Just 2 quick questions, mainly to make sure that the technology is working for everyone, but it's useful information as well. So if Shelby, if you can call up the first panel with the tech check questions. We're getting a black, I'm seeing a black area in front of it, so. There we go. Okay, question number 1. Which of the following is an essential component of sound antimicrobial stewardship? And there's 3 options there. A, using only vaccines and probiotics to manage disease on your farm. B, moving to injectable antimicrobials exclusively. And then C, include careful diagnosis of bacterial disease in your herd before using antimicrobials. So it looks like answers are coming in. Looks like that's good. People were able to vote, at least some were. And I think this is the correct answer, Professor Rugg. And then the second question, what aspects of cattle management impact health and should always be on the mind of a farmer? And the options are A, ventilation, B, cleanliness and sanitation, C, good nutrition, D, monitoring animal performance, and then E, all of the above. And it looks like, yeah, I can't see the full screen, Shelby, but it looks like people did very well on both questions. We know these were softballs. They were easy. They were meant to be easy to just check to make sure that you're able to get on and ask questions when you need to. So I think, Shelby, to stay on schedule, we'll move on then and hear from Matt Smith from Louise Earl Butcher. Who's going to describe this morning his views on retail advocacy and consumer support. And we're really happy to have someone who's out at the front lines meeting with and talking to our end users, our customers. And Matt has a lot of experience with that. And we thought it would be a good change of pace to hear some of his views on that. So Matt, if you're there, take it away.
My name is Matt Smith. I am the owner of Louise Earl Butcher. We're located in Grand Rapids on the southeast side, and we're a whole animal artisan butcher shop that supports local farmers. Want to thank MSU for inviting me to be a speaker today in the Management Over Medicine seminar, and I'm going to kind of give my perspective from the retailer to the consumers and kind of how we come into play on this whole topic. What I'd like to do is kind of start off. Here in the shop, we have a lot of kind of sayings that we refer to kind of sometimes remind us or inspire us as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the first one that I wanted to reference is the food you eat can either be the safest, most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. And that was from Ann Wigmore. She was a holistic practitioner early in the century. And so, you know, one of the things that we sometimes think about is that food can be medicine. That's kind of one of the reasons why we opened this shop almost 6 years ago. We opened January 16, and we really wanted to offer the public some better choices and at the same time support our local farmers. And we'll talk a little bit about how that plays into this topic. As I mentioned, we opened in 2016. My wife, Cindy, who works here in the shop also, we've kind of been in and around food for basically our whole lives, passionate about food, and wanted to share that passion with our community and bring some better choices to the area. We subscribe to supporting our local farmers, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. We have all of our animals coming from farms that are within 60 miles of the shop. We have pastured lamb, pastured chicken, heritage breed pork, 100% beef, 100% grass-fed and finished beef. And how does this play into management over medicine in the animals that we buy for the shop and sell to the general public here in Grand Rapids? To give you an example, the pork farmer, the hog farmer that we deal with in Coopersville, when we first met them, they were at the time 3 generations into farming hogs, had largely been involved in commercial hog farming in the past, and were just dipping their toe into some heritage breed hogs, and we kind of encourage them to get heavier into that, and at the same time kind of change some of their practices that they used for the commercial commodity style farming in the past, which means we encourage them to switch their diet over to a non-GMO diet. At first, the farmer really thought that was going to be challenging. And as he put a little effort into it, he found that there were a lot of options out there for non-GMO. As that program started to develop and be successful, he then actually started to raise his own grain, non-GMO grain, on the farm. And my understanding is that less than 5% of all the farms in the United States actually raise the grain that they feed to their livestock. And so by us supporting that farmer, he's been able to make better choices, we think, in the practices that he uses to raise the hogs. I think also the chicken scenario is one to mention as kind of a success story. Our farmer started to raise pastured chickens for us, also raises pastured laying hens for our eggs, and same kind of success. That program has grown immensely. He's growing the grain for his heritage breed chickens, and then actually took on the responsibility, built his own processing plant on farm. And so the only thing that our farmer doesn't do is hatch the birds, but he grows the birds, grows the grain, and processes the birds all right on the farm. The reason I bring these things up is that management over medicine, when these farmers are using practices that create more of a regenerative versus extractive farming practice, it makes the ground healthier. It makes the animals healthier. And there's much less need for any medication, because when we start with, in this case, the ground, then the animals follow in suit and are much healthier and do not need medications to mitigate any problems that may come up. And so those are some examples of how the product that we bring in here starts out. Something else that I would kind of like to reference as far as the saying goes is the bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low prices are forgotten. Sometimes people ask us, how are you doing as far as the product that you sell here? It is a product that compared to commodity products is a little bit higher priced, but we often like to reference the first saying about people's health and people being more conscientious about what they're putting into their bodies these days is something that we see more and more people being conscientious of. And so while the product may be a little more than a commodity product, something from a grocery store, the reception has been tremendous. And we've actually, here in the butcher shop, experienced double-digit growth every year since we've opened up. Check my notes here. As I mentioned, who are the customers? You might think that just because people are being more health conscious, it might be a demographic that is more affluent, but that's not actually always the case. In fact, when we looked for a location to put our butcher shop, we spent a lot of time. In fact, it took us almost 2 years to find a building to open the business in. And that was because we were very specific about wanting this location to be demographically in the most diverse and crossroads area we think that Grand Rapids offers. And so to give you an example, to the east, we have East Grand Rapids, very fluent, wealthy area. but just to the south of us, Baxter neighborhood is probably one of the poorer areas of Grand Rapids. Heritage Hill, the Hill districts are just to the north of us, and then downtown to the west. And so what we've actually seen is that people who are concerned about their health, what they're putting in their body, and consuming or providing for their family come from all different diversities, demographics. And so we certainly have affluent customers who budgets are not maybe an issue, but we also have people that use EBT and food assistance programs that we accept here. And so I think that that just speaks to the fact that when it comes to better food, better health, it's not something that is specific to one demographic. And that's another reason why we kind of do what we do here in the shop at Louise Earl Butcher, because we're trying to provide a better product to anyone who's interested in it. And we think that that kind of starts with the farmer. We do the best that we can to just translate that product to the end consumer. And so that's kind of what we're all about here at Louise Earl Butcher, and how we support the farmers that try to practice the management over medicine thought process and mentality. And so thanks everyone for, again, inviting me and listening to what we have to say from kind of a retail perspective, and look forward to continuing to support MSU and all the farmers and people who are involved in this movement.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent. And we've had a couple of good questions come in. If you'd like to answer them in real time, maybe you've answered them privately already, but I think they're good questions, and I think the broader audience would be interested in hearing your response. The first one, and I'll paraphrase, is there a single quality in a local farm that your customers are seeking? Do they mention and seem to understand responsible use of antimicrobials in your discussions with them?
Sure. Yeah, I think that we get a lot of questions. Refreshingly, we get a lot of questions from people really wanting to understand, number one, where the products are coming from. I think people are really focused on local. And then what are the practices that the farmers are using? And I think that that kind of translates to people wanting to understand, what am I putting into my body? What am I consuming? And if those animals have been raised in a method that falls in line with their ideals, then they're going to be happy. And that's what we try to really promote here, is the story of the farmers, transparency on how the animals are raised, so that the consumer can have that confidence.
And that's the second question is, how should a local farmer approach a shop like yours? What information do you consider when a new farmer would come to you and say, Matt, we're interested in working with you and providing lamb or chicken or beef? What factors weigh your decision?
Sure, that's it can be a deep question. We're always happy to have a conversation with a new farmer who's looking to kind of walk down this path. We're happy to share with them the standards that we're looking for. And oftentimes when people start to get into that game, we want to kind of understand what practices they're subscribing to. And so, for example, maybe a beef farmer comes to us and says, hey, I got some really great beef. We raise it like this. Are you interested? We oftentimes will ask for things like loin pictures from a hanging carcass. Or if it's somebody who's maybe a smaller farmer that's raising lamb or chicken, if it's a local farmer, we may ask to visit their farm and really kind of get to know them, get to understand, and see what kind of practices they're using, so that again we can reference back to that and provide the confidence to our consumer that we've actually done the work. We've already set foot on the farms to really understand what they're all about, and we can transfer that story onto the end consumer.
Thank you. Well, I think we're right on time, and I saw that Professor Apley was able to join us. Thank you, Matt. I saw that Professor Apley was able to join us. For those of you who, maybe probably few of you who don't know Professor Apley, he comes to us from Kansas State University, and I was very happy to see that his Bobcats won on Saturday, so he should be in a good mood today. And Professor Apley is going to talk today about the future of antimicrobials in food animal production. So Professor Apley, if you're there, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Apley from Kansas State University. I teach production medicine and clinical pharmacology here at Kansas State. Today, I'm going to be talking about the future of antimicrobials in food animal medicine. Struggled a little bit with exactly what context to put this in, but I went back to the basics of clinical pharmacology, being a clinical pharmacologist, and put it into 4 basic components of clinical pharmacology that I think describes how we as veterinarians and food animal producers are going to be addressing antimicrobial use in the future. And that's, can I do some good? Can I do some harm? Can I get it in the animal? And what does it cost? And of course, can I get it in the animal means, do I have a reasonable regimen I can use? So when we break down, can I do some good? We're talking about welfare and conservation of animal resources, which is one of the things in our veterinary oath. Then when we talk about, can I do some harm? In the past, a lot of times we've just thought about direct toxicity, but also regulations, residues, and market chain access. Today, we have different market chains with very specific requirements. And by recommending or using an antimicrobial or a drug in a certain manner, we could make it impossible for our client to sell into the market chain for which they prepared the animals. And again, the practical regimen, we're going to come back to about different ways of looking at the cost. But when we start breaking out, can I do some harm? Before we talked about direct toxicity of the drug, regulatory harm, residues, market chain access, and of course, regulatory would include having a violative residue at slaughter. But today we include considerations such as the microbiota and the environmental resistome alteration. What could we be doing in the population of bacteria that are not necessarily associated with our direct pathogen of interest? And that leads also to resistance development and direct pathogens for the animals and foodborne pathogens. That's really a tough part of the equation to get a handle on with direct evidence. A friend of mine has told me that if you understand antibiotic resistance, it hasn't been adequately explained to you. And I think that's a very astute observation that's incredibly complicated. And the fact of the matter is, we're going to move on in the next decade without having a lot of that settled, which makes it difficult to include that in parts of our equation. And then maybe cost isn't just about the price of the drug. The cost could be in resistance. The cost could be in market chain access. There are a lot of things in there that are externalities, different costs that aren't necessarily related to science. If we're going to talk about the future of antimicrobials, we need to talk about the past. So if we look way back in 1910 and 1912, we basically had arsenical compounds that the goal of these compounds was to kill the bacteria slightly before it took you out. So they weren't a very friendly drug, but they were the best we had. In 35, the first sulfas came out for use. In 42, we got benzylpenicillin, which is procaine pen-G as we know it. Tetracyclines in 48, and then here they came. In the 40s and 50s, we had all these first members of our groups, and it was really fascinating to see these all come in. And then by the 85, we got the carbapenems, and then it started to slow down. And we've got the linezolid, a member of the oxazolidinones in 2000 and 2003, daptomycin, one of the cyclic lipopeptides. If you look at the ones that we use in food animal medicine, the last year we got a new drug group that is a direct action antibiotic that we use in food animal medicine, it was 1978. So we're a long ways in, way over 40 years since we had the last new group. We've had new members of the groups, but they're the same basic chemistry. We now have some new novel compounds being developed on the human side. There's over 40 compounds in development worldwide, but only about 4 of them are new, actual unique classes, unique mechanisms of action. This just illustrates that in food animal medicine, we're not going to have a whole lot of new tools. We have the ones that we have. We need to move forward and be sure to conserve those. And it's all wrapped up in antimicrobial stewardship, and I was glad to see the AVMA put significant time into developing an antimicrobial stewardship definition. And one of the really big things is that as a profession, we are obligated to preserve the effectiveness and availability of antimicrobial drugs. And we have to utilize responsible medical decision-making and safeguard animal, public, and environmental health. It's a great definition. Sometimes getting down into the details can be a little challenging. They have gone forward with some further breakouts, but coordinated interventions improve and measure the appropriate use of antimicrobials. So that measure is a big part that's in our future. And looking at the optimal regimen, dose, duration of therapy, and route of administration. We use a lot of single administration antimicrobials in food animals. We're very fortunate there, but in our daily administered drugs through the feed or through the water and some injectables, and also in the human medical field, we are woefully under-supported in how we make a reasonable decision on duration of use. The duration of therapy supporting data just isn't there for us. And in my way of thinking, as we look towards the future of antimicrobial use, we really need to sort that out. We want the optimal clinical outcomes, minimize toxicity, reduce costs, limit the selection for antimicrobial resistant strains. And there's another component where we could definitely use more research, but so much of what's going to happen in the next decade is going to evolve around what we know, what we think we know, and what we're scared we don't know, the unknown unknowns, in relation to selection for antimicrobial resistant strains. And some parts of the world have dealt with that with the precautionary principle, where unless you can prove it's safe, it's out. We haven't gone there yet in the United States, but when you're worried about what you don't know to be worried about, sometimes we get awfully conservative, and conservative meaning being very reluctant to allow much use of these compounds. If we look at stewardship, this again defines our future. The first thing is we have to be using reasonable and appropriate diagnostics and have very accurate and functional case definitions. That is the classic partnership between a veterinarian and their client. And without those, we can't move forward and claim that we are using these drugs within stewardship and in a judicious manner. This number 2 part, is there a non-antibiotic alternative? This is one of the biggest parts of our future, is looking for reasonable non-antibiotic alternatives that will prevent, control, or treat the disease challenge. We already see prevention with antimicrobials prohibited in at least one state. We have other states considering that. The boundary between prevention and control is sometimes rather fuzzy. And of course, individual animal treatment is something we'd all agree we need to do. We'd also agree we need to do everything possible to not have to treat those. So this non-antibiotic alternative component of stewardship is going to continue to become more and more into the forefront as we move forward in this next decade. And that's selecting an antibiotic which has been demonstrated as safe and effective for this purpose. That safe and effective is going to continue to take on a new meaning. And the safe part is not only going to be direct toxicity to the animal or toxicity by passing a residue through the food chain, it's now going to continue to be more and more focused on that somewhat nebulous concept of what might we be doing to select for resistance and pathogens of concern for veterinary species, and also what impact might we have on human therapy. And this 4th part, to me, is how I truly tell if a veterinarian has a VCPR. If they can tell me whether people are following their protocols they've come up together with, then I know whether or not they have a VCPR. You can have all the printed, written out VCPR agreements you want, all the written protocols that everyone signed, but unless we really know how they're being followed, to me, I'm not sure we really have the VCPR established. And this is also a tough part of figuring out whether that antibiotic intervention is still necessary, and I think that's one of our biggest challenges. But in the future, we're going to have to double up on going back and making sure that any antibiotic interventions we've established in prevention or control are actually still necessary. And then, no, you stop, or yes, you go back looking for that non-antibiotic alternative. Some may look at this and think it's a little Pollyanna, a little academic, but I think it defines the steps we're going to have to be engaged in, and we're going to be watched as to how we're engaging these steps. So when we talk about those antibiotic alternatives, would you recommend or prescribe, and would a client adopt an alternative which possibly raises the cost of production, requires an alteration in production practices, results in a detrimental effect on animal welfare, or risks you losing a client or incurring liability for losses? Those are the hard questions right there. We can talk about considering resistance, but resistance can be a far off concept over the horizon where immediate concerns are cost of production, maintaining production, staying in business, et cetera. How we balance that is going to be a major debate and a major focus in this next 10 years. And what would be an incentive to adopt such an alternative? If we have something that could be an antibiotic alternative with lower cost and same or improved efficacy, not going to be a problem putting that in. The market access, if people are willing to pay, regulatory penalties, preservation of antimicrobial efficacy, that last one is really difficult to quantify and put into the equation. So here's the core questions it comes down to. Do you believe your actions as a veterinarian or a producer in your use have any effect on the future efficacy of antimicrobials in animals and humans? And if yes, are you willing to take any personal risk in an attempt to minimize the effects of your antimicrobial use of prescribing? Those are the hard questions. And frankly, we have a hard time answering them with some of the data we have. If you look at what antibiotics we're using, it's really clear that we have a large emphasis on macrolides and tetracyclines. Penicillin's used quite a little bit, a lot of it in turkeys, orally in water, but the macrolides and tetracyclines dominate in both cattle and swine. I wanted to make you aware of a recent set of pilot studies through a cooperative agreement with the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine, where we quantified antimicrobial use in 22 USB feed yards as one of the papers. And if you look at it, this is milligrams per kilogram of live weight. You can also look at it as regimens per animal year. And the study of how metrics affect your view of antimicrobial use is really important. And if you go through these papers, there's a lot of really good explanations in there from the different species. But the insets just magnify the use for control of respiratory disease and individual animal treatment for all diseases because they're so low. So you can look at the different antimicrobials, but here's the actual values. And you can see that in-feed use dominates. And in milligrams per kilogram of live weight, if you add up the macrolides in green and the purple color is the tetracyclines, if you add those up, you're at about 95% of the milligrams of drug use per kilograms live weight. If you drop it down to regimens per animal year, these two categories would make up about 85%, which emphasizes that our in-feed and in-water use to groups of animals are going to be a focus in the next few years as to why we're using them and the ramifications of using them. So we talked about resistance. This is the integrative conjugative element that we find in Mannheimia hemolytica. It carries multiple different antimicrobial resistance genes on this integrative conjugative element called the ICE, and it can be passed back and forth between our three main respiratory pathogens as well as E. coli in the lab. And this is a paper that I look at that to me illustrates what we're going to have to continue to consider in relation to resistance such as that. This was a paper out of Iowa State where they looked at isolates coming into their diagnostic lab and looked at records for how many times the animal was treated and correlated that with resistance. And what we found was, they found was that if they were treated none, once, twice, or 3 times, the percent of resistant isolates went up, and it went up across all drugs due to that integrated conjugative element, possibly being in there and causing multiple drug resistance. And it just shows that as we put more and more pressure in those animals with therapeutics, we can bring out those resistant subsets. So this is something to me that really shows we have an issue to deal with. So those FDA CVM cooperative agreements were made publicly available in a free access special edition and can be accessed here. I think we'll close with the FDA's view of what's going to happen in the next, will end by 2022 or 23, but their 5-year plan currently in effect. And the most important parts to me are that we're going to have a very clear emphasis on duration and a very clear focus that over-the-counter antimicrobial use is going to be gone by the end of 2022. Those are the things that strike me as the biggest components of explaining to us what we're going to be doing over the next decade or so. There's going to be a huge emphasis on what we're doing with antimicrobials in relation to selecting for resistance in our own pathogens and possibly having an effect on therapeutics in people, and the transparency through initiatives such as antimicrobial use monitoring are going to continue to increase, putting us more and more in the public arena for our use. With that, I'll look forward to questions.
Thank you, Professor Apley. That was really nice. We did have a few really good questions come in. I'm not sure if you've seen them, but if it's okay, we'll answer them live, and I'll paraphrase them. First question was, after 5 years, how satisfied is the FDA with the outcomes of VFD?
Well, the veterinary feed directive is clearly, it's a temporal association. There were some changes right away where our use of tetracycline is cut almost in half. In beef cattle, the tylosin use, macrolide use went up because we've been using less than the stated grams per ton to stay in the milligrams per pound range on the label. And once that was realized, we've got a letter from the FDA saying until that's straightened out, use the grams per ton you need to stay within the milligrams per pound range. So those were 2 things that happened. If you look at global vet link, the vast majority of VFDs being written are for beef cattle. There's quite a few for swine also, but beef cattle, especially with things like anaplasmosis control claims. And we went through a period of really having to work to get some of the nuances ironed out, the details of writing the VFDs, making sure they were legal. I would say that as of right now, except for a couple of smaller areas where we still have some areas that need clarification, it's worked pretty well. And I don't think they went into this with an idea that this was specifically going to decrease sales quantities as they monitor every year, but rather to increase the interaction between veterinarians and their clients related to these in-feed uses that previously did not require that. And I can tell you that this has, and it's from my personal communications with veterinarians and producers, it's led to a whole lot of conversations about what really needs to be used and how it's best used, which I think was the goal. And for that, I can't speak for them, but I would say that many of us feel that that ability to have those conversations has led to a lot of consideration of exactly which one of these uses is really doing us good.
But on aggregate, it does look like the VFD did stimulate a net reduction in use of medically important antimicrobials across the industries.
Yeah.
So maybe from the end user's perspective, and we'll ask Matt to comment in a minute, but maybe for the meat buying customers, actually reducing the amount was an important endpoint to achieve. But
Yeah.
Mike, you answer that first, and then we'll give Matt a chance if he.
Yeah, I think one of the things about that is we have to be real careful on the denominator, because we've got all of our use data we have in this country is without a denominator, and the FDA's worked on that. And then also the use is related to disease events that cause the need for the use. So there's a lot of things confounding there where I can talk about what's happened since the VFD labels went in effect, basically 5 years ago. I'm pretty careful to put cause and effect, very cautious in talking cause and effect. Matt?
Matt, you have to turn the mute off if you want to comment on this. If you want to think about it a little bit more, we can bring it back up in the discussion in a few minutes. It's up to you.
Yeah, not something that I have a great degree of knowledge on. And it's something that I would say I haven't heard a lot from the customers on this particular item. And so, from our perspective, on the retail end of the business, probably not a big focus item. Maybe people just in the general consumer population haven't heard enough or don't know enough about it.
Mike, another question that came in, I like, does the U.S. have a defined target for reduction of drug-resistant strains in the environment? How are they testing for that?
No, they don't have a defined target that I'm aware of. There is talk about more testing. One of the really controversial aspects of that testing would be the ability to go on farm and collect samples on farm, especially with follow-up. So as everyone listening here would know, that we tend to be rather independent-minded in ag, both veterinarians and producers, and there's been pushback on that. The other thing about the environmental sampling is, assigning causation to it is, can be problematic, but they are, as I'm aware, there is more of a push to be able to go collect these samples and see what's going on with at least some indicator organisms.
Thank you. Mike, we had a few other questions that we'll come back to during the discussion, but to stay on task, I think Shelby, we'll go ahead and take that second tech check, which will be very, very quick. And there's two questions again. The first question is, many consumers across demographic groups understand how animals are raised affects the animal's health and why this is worth investing in from a human nutritional perspective. This is a true, false, or need more information question. So one that people are having to think about a little bit. And hopefully our question or our response tool is still working, Shelby.
Do you have to answer both questions to be able to get in their responses?
Oh, you do? Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. So
They
then the
might be
second.
stuck on that first one, but they might be on the second one as well.
Thanks, Shelby. So the second question is, two likely areas that FDA will focus on going forward in terms of building on antimicrobial stewardship gains achieved since implementation of VFD guidelines in 2017 are A, adding ionophores and probiotics to the list of products requiring veterinary oversight, B, limiting duration of therapy and over-the-counter availability of antimicrobials, and C, neither A nor B above are correct. So I can't see the response to that, Shelby. I suspect, okay, yes. So most people that answered are getting that correct, limiting the duration of therapy and over the counter. And Professor Apley, how confident are you that those will be two areas that will be focused on? I know you're privy to a lot of information.
So you want me to go ahead and answer that number two?
Yeah.
Okay. The first one I would see is incredibly remote. There's been discussion on the probiotics and what resistance genes they might harbor, but certainly not a BFD veterinary oversight issue. The limiting duration of therapy and over-the-counter availability of antimicrobials, definitely. The limiting duration of therapy is, let me say, definitely to the over-the-counter availability of antimicrobials. They've put out a guidance document, and it's clear that well, the timing is approximate, but probably fourth quarter 2022, first quarter 2023, we will probably see all over-the-counter medically important antimicrobials removed. As far as limiting duration of therapy, they have pointed at and said, we need to evaluate that. And how do we evaluate that? But for actually limiting it yet, I'd say we're still in the process of evaluating that. But duration of therapy is really a focus.
Thank you. And Matt, I think it's interesting that the opinion was pretty well divided regarding the question before that. Many consumers across demographic groups understand how animals are raised, affects their health, and why it's worth investing in from a human nutritional perspective. There's really two parts to that question, at least, maybe more, but I think it is a fair question for you. How many, and maybe your customers are more sophisticated than the average customer, but how educated do you think they are about issues around antimicrobial use?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the general population probably isn't too highly focused on it. Yes, probably our customer here in the shop maybe is a little bit more tuned into it, but I would say that we are niche-y. We're a very small player. We're a real small shop if you compare us to the big box retailers. And so probably the people that shop with us are a little bit more in tune with how the animals are raised, what kind of methods are being used. But we're a small percentage of that market, I would say.
Thank you. I think what we'll do then to stay on track is we'll move to the what really be the next to last part of our program this morning, and that'll be a panel discussion. And I think Shelby and I came up with a few questions that came up multiple times. Most of them didn't get answered. They're questions that didn't get answered. But Shelby, do you have that slide that has the questions that we've scrambled together here? Okay, great, thank you. Can everyone see these? And I think what we'll do is we'll ask Professor Ruegg maybe to take number one, and we'll kind of split things up a little bit, at least to get the responses going. And so Professor Ruegg, the question was, what are the most important but often missed opportunities in terms of management practices available to farmers for improving antimicrobial stewardship on their farms? Where are they missing out now? Where could they realize some significant bang for their buck that, based on your observations, they're not seeing? You're on mute, Professor Ruegg.
Got on mute here. I was talking to myself. You'd think after a year and a half, we'd have that figured out. I think one of the biggest opportunities, and I think this is both an economic opportunity for the farmers and a sustainability, is engaging with their local veterinarians to really discuss evidence-based guidelines for their current existing treatment protocols using antimicrobials. And so I think that engagement is often taken for granted. But I think what often is really going on is people may have had a discussion a few years back about a particular treatment protocol, and then it sits there and there's drift that occurs on the farms and things change. And so I think one of the biggest things, I was intrigued by Dr. Apley's comments about duration and things like that. You know, in my field, especially in dairy, the duration of treatment needs a lot of definition. We really use a lot of the products off-label, or if they've got a flexible label, at the maximum or close to the maximum. And as we're learning more about having an actual diagnosis, knowing what the actual pathogen is, learning more about with what randomized clinical trials that are negatively controlled tell us, we're learning that we don't necessarily have to treat as long as possible. So I think, you know, that engagement where, and that focus on evidence-based treatment is an area we could improve in.
Thank you. I see Phil Durst turned his picture and sound back on, which means he's dying to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. So, you know, I really think it's important for farmers to react aggressively when an animal gets sick or when an animal dies, and to find out why the animal got sick, why the animal died. You know, I've been on too many farms where you know, sometimes an animal is sick and or an animal dies, and they say, well, you know, it happens sooner or later. It's regrettable. It happens sooner or later. But the problem is, it happens again and it happens again, and their concern level starts to ratchet up. But what I want to encourage farmers to do is be concerned on that very first case. If we're going to prevent problems, we have to react quickly and aggressively when we find out that there's an animal that's sick, because if there's an animal that's sick, it's most likely going to be a herd problem that's being experienced, whether it's environmental or whether it's nutritional. The animal has become vulnerable. The exposure level is there, so those things need to be investigated, need to be promptly understood, so that we can prevent a death, or we can prevent the next one from getting sick. And when we do that, then, you know, that's the whole start of stewardship is to be able to prevent. And so I think that finding out why an animal is sick, finding out why an animal dies is a critical step that we've got to be more aggressive on.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to give Mike a chance to comment on that if he would like to. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Benjamin, who just joined us, who has some expertise in that particular area, to comment if she will. So, Mike?
Well, it kind of blends into number two below, but I think the real missed opportunities are routine interaction between the veterinarian and the producer towards that goal of reducing the disease pressure. And I think there's a lot of things that we have opportunities to look at. Environmental, it doesn't have to be through a needle, you know, and the information we're getting on genetics and their contribution to disease, to me, is fascinating. I just am learning enough to know how much I don't know about that, but I'm really tuned in to what opportunities we find in looking at genetics, among many other things. So a lot of opportunities that come up through routine interaction.
Thank you, Mike. And Madonna Benjamin, I know, is an expert in remote sensing, and she's actually been in the barn all morning working on a study this morning. So she didn't have time to shower, but that's okay. Madonna, maybe you'd like to comment, if you will, on the potential you see for remote sensing and monitoring for early detection and disease and other conditions that might eventually provide another tool for farmers in terms of their efforts to achieve high levels of antimicrobial stewardship.
Thanks, Dave, for that opportunity. I want to go back, and Dr. Apley's shared a publication, and thank you all speakers. And if Dave gives me any credit, he's lying. He did all the work. He and Shelby did all the work.
True.
But anyway, Mike had presented a paper where the number of doses of treatment was correlated with resistance, and my thought on that was I wonder what the timing was, kind of fitting in with what Phil was saying about early detection, early treatment, and making decisions. And we have SOPs in many of the barns where someone is responsible for oftentimes for walking around and observing animals and marking them to be treated or treated. But I wonder what would happen if we were to increase our opportunity for observation. So whether that would be by having both morning and night, and then the person who is responsible, for example, for euthanasia would then follow up and do that, or the treatments, or that a different view. And this is what we're alluding to in precision livestock farming, because with precision livestock farming, what I've noticed is when I use computer vision and I show the stock person the image, they will make a comment on her state. And what that tells me is that they're looking at it from a different pair of eyes. I mean, we become accustomed, there's that old adage of that the gorilla in the middle of the pathology slide, and 50% of the pathologists missed the gorilla because they were so focused on the fact that this was a specific type of cell. And I think that happens for our stock people too, is that they're doing what they need to do, Perhaps the body condition score of an animal is low, and that may be due to cachexia. She's losing weight because of illness. But it's something they've seen before, and so it doesn't really register. And I look forward to precision livestock farming or computer imaging or the other senses such as accelerometers or sound. And then that interface that we present to the stock person or the farmer that shows them what that animal looks like or sounds like, only with a different pair of eyes/ears. So thanks, Dave. I think that might improve our detection, and it may improve our opportunities for response. And the last comment is that people need the tools to be able to respond and the permission to respond quickly and make a decision about an animal. Thank you.
So continuing to thank you, Madonna. Continuing to build those relationships with the veterinarians who serve them, and then going forward, animal monitoring going to become very important to really probably improve early detection and then allow more individual pig care, which should
Dave,
both benefit. Yes, Bill.
that was one of the things that Jack Jeppesen mentioned on their farm is, of course, the ability to monitor cows' temperature, activity, rumination, and to be able to use that to detect animals that aren't feeling well. Certainly, we're in the early stages of that. I think that there will be improvements to that, but technology has a real place to help us to identify animals that for some reason are just off, and to understand why it is, so that we can care for them quickly and also prevent further cases of it.
Madonna, thank you, Phil. Madonna, you had a comment to that? No, she's pushed her. Okay, my comment is I think these are excellent points, but veterinarians can be fairly expensive, and monitoring equipment can be fairly expensive. And I think that's fine for the large producer, but what about the small producer? I mean, would you recommend the same for a small producer, a small dairyman, a small farmer that keeps pigs or chickens? Where's the break-even point for that expensive professional advice that you're recommending?
Can I chime in again?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not sure what number of cows you can justify having that system, but let me just also say that in dairy we have a real advantage. Our cows are coming into a parlor 2 or 3 times a day. We have people there that are seeing our cows. We have people there that are feeding our calves, and I think that the greatest challenge is also in training our workers to identify animals that are not feeling well. So to identify animals as normal or to identify animals as not normal. As we have employees, whether they're family members or employees, they need to be able to identify those animals before they're just dead out sick. And we need to train people who are working with the animals to identify it. That's cheap monitoring. That's eyeball monitoring, and that's the first level that we need to make sure that we're doing is have the ability to pick up on the fact that an animal is not feeling well today and understand why.
Thank you, Phil. We had a few questions come in that we didn't get to around poultry today. And I'm going to kind of tweak the 2 or 3 that came in on poultry and ask Matt to comment and then the panel to comment. The questions were around, why didn't we talk about poultry today? Why didn't anybody really mention poultry? And the second part of their question was it because that there isn't very much in the way of antimicrobials used in poultry today? The other question was around, do consumers consume more poultry? Is poultry continuing to increase in the amount of consumption, at least in the US, in part because consumers are savvy enough to understand that a lot of poultry is raised with very little antimicrobial. Does that enter into the equation? So I think we'll let Matt answer that part first, and then we'll come back to poultry and what's going on with poultry. And I will probably ask Mike to comment first on that after Matt.
Yeah, I think for our farmer who raises all of our chickens, and we have a couple different breeds we work with on top of also having laying hens. I had a little discussion with the farmer about this topic that we're the discussion today, and he really pointed towards the health of the land that he pastures the birds on as kind of where he can kind of avoid having to deal with a lot of antibiotic treatments and that type of thing. And so, from my farmer's perspective, that's kind of where he says is where he really concentrates on is the health of the land, which translates to the health of the animal.
Thank you. And Mike, would you like to comment on that?
So when we talk about poultry, there's an entire range of intensive farming operations to backyard poultry to, pasture poultry, which Matt just mentioned. And so we have to be careful about lumping them all together. So this is my understanding of working with people like Randy Singer, that about 60% of the poultry in the supermarket today is produced under some kind of no antibiotics ever or antibiotic-free system, which in many of the cases still allows the use of the chemical coccidiostats, but not a medically important antibiotic, and in some cases, not even the ionophores. And so if you want an idea of what's going on with antibiotic use in poultry, the paper I mentioned where we did the feedlot study has companion papers by Dr. Singer and his group on turkeys and broilers, and well over 90% of the antibiotic use in about 90% plus of the broiler population in the United States is characterized in his paper, and about 75% of the turkey production, and they're working on bringing laying hens online. So you can go, those are free access. I referenced those in my talk where they can go see what's going on with that. There's also papers out there that deal with the welfare implications of that in intensive systems, even with some alterations, what the welfare implications are of that. So it's just like all things to do with stewardship and antibiotic use. It's really hard to make an overall lump statement because there's such a spread of different activities, management styles, and uses and disease pressures throughout the industry.
Thank you, Mike. And Professor Ruegg, if you'd like to comment on poultry at all before we move into the final phase.
I'm completely unqualified to comment on poultry.
I doubt that, but I'll tell you, Matt, I haven't had lunch yet today, and I had a light breakfast, and seeing those beautiful steaks on Matt's slide are really making my mouth water here. So
Mission
I
accomplished.
wanna close by thanking our audience for sticking with us. I want to thank the panel for doing a great job, great presentations, and really enjoyed the discussion afterwards. But what I really want to do is let you all know that it is my birthday today. I have a bet with my boss that we will get 100% of our participants, both panel members and people who phoned in to complete our post-program survey. We are the university. We measure every single little thing we do. And we get in big trouble if we don't get good measurements. So please take just a few minutes, if you will, and make my birthday a happy one, and make my boss happy, and take our poll before you leave. The last question on the poll is ask you whether you need to have a certificate of course completion for 2 hours of continuing ed credits. And for that, you just need to say yes, and then give us an email to send your certificate to. But thanks, everyone. Please stay on to take the poll, and safe travels for those that are traveling, and have a great day. Thank you so much.